Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denfo Chifongodze. I facilitate the seminar series at the Center for Civil Society. Welcome to the Center for Civil Society seminar series on South Africa in comparative perspective, India and Brazil. So we're just doing a comparative study of South African policies with that of India and Brazil and in the context of BRICS. So today we are privileged to be joined by Lubna, Nadvi, who will give a seminar titled Active Citizenship in an Evolving BRICS, Reflections on India and South Africa. We are happy to have you at the Center for Civil Society, Lubna, and we look forward to learning more about your talk and about your study on citizenship. To introduce Lubna to those that don't know her, Lubna is an academic and researcher based in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her expertise is in the field of political science, international relations, gender and feminist studies, civil society, Middle East, Indo-Pak and African politics, political Islam and social movements. Nadvi has made an active contribution to various local South African struggles and campaigns, including the anti-apartheid youth student movement, HIV/AIDS awareness, women's and children's rights, street and informal trader struggles, subsistence livelihoods, fee-free higher education, amongst others. In this capacity, she has served on the provincial and regional structures of movements such as the social movements Indaba and the eThekwini Social Forum, and currently serves on the EXCO of the Active Citizens Movement. Her international solidarity work includes contributing to the Global Anti-War Coalition, as well as support for Palestinian, Syrian, and Rohingya and other refugee communities. She has a BA honors from the University of Durban, Westville, an MA from Coventry University, an MA in diplomacy, law and global change, and a PhD from University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you so much, Lubna, for joining us and for making time. I'll just not take much of the time and just want to thank you for joining us. I'll just give you 30 minutes to give us your presentation, and then after that, we'll have a question and answer session where you will respond to some of the questions that will be posed by our audience. To the audience, may you keep your mics on mute. Over to you, Lubna.
Thank you very much. And my sincere apologies to everyone. I'm actually in a room with colleagues, so this is a hybrid session. I hope that I'm audible before I proceed.
You are crystal clear.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I tried to set up the slideshow in the slideshow format, and it's giving me a problem. So I hope it's okay if I just leave it like this, and as long as I can just, move my slides. So thank you very much to the Center for Civil Society for giving me this opportunity to actually present this seminar. And before I continue, I just wanted to make a disclaimer that this is very much work in progress, and I'm just beginning to scratch the surface of looking at the issue of how citizens are engaging within the context of the BRICS framework. My key interest really is in looking at how citizens engage actively in broader civil society. And during my sabbatical last year, I had begun to explore this both within the South African context and the Indian context. And I had traveled to India to talk to people there and to try and collect some data from the ground. So the core work that I'm actually focusing on is looking at active citizenship. in these two case studies, but I have now begun to try and look at it from the framework of BRICS. And that's why it's something I have just started with. And this seminar is not necessarily going to present any grand findings, but I just want to share some thoughts around how I'm locating the conversation and how I'm beginning to try and look at the role that citizens do play within the context of BRICS. So in terms of the outline of my presentation, I'm just going to try and see if I can move my slide. There we go. I want to just give a brief background about BRICS. There's a lot that's been discussed around it. There's a lot that has been said about BRICS. I want to just give a brief background to that and then move into looking at some of the goals and aims, which I've kind of gathered from the academics that have been writing around it, and then move into looking at the issue of engagement with citizens within the BRICS framework of the member states in particular. And then, of course, talk about India and South Africa, which is sort of the focus of this seminar, and then some concluding thoughts. So let me begin by just providing a brief background. Most of you would know that BRICS is an intergovernmental organization, was set up in 2009 as a partnership between 4 emerging markets and developing countries, and as an alternative economic bloc to that of the industrialized Western nations, basically your G7. And these 4 original members were Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And South Africa then joined the bloc in 2010, 2011. And more recently, in 2023, there were a few more countries that were invited to join BRICS as members, namely Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. They joined BRICS as members. Argentina was invited but declined to join, and Saudi Arabia was still not sure. It has not really confirmed its membership. The more recent sort of summit that we had of BRICS in 2024, several more countries were invited to attend the summit, but not necessarily to join the BRICS membership. So it's interesting to see how this is unfolding, because what is this telling us? It's saying that the original 4 members that then became 5 are looking at really expanding this sort of entity called BRICS in terms of the sort of strength of the global south, because these original countries were looking at how to effectively set up an entity that was going to challenge the hegemony and the dominance of the G7 and the Bretton Woods institutions and so on. And so what we're seeing is obviously how BRICS is expanding in the global south. And it's interesting to see the countries that have been actually asked to join the membership. And of course, we can chat about that and what, for example, Ethiopia may have to offer BRICS and so on and so on. So BRICS basically has 3 pillars of cooperation. These are the first, political and security cooperation; second, financial and economic cooperation. And that was this kind of original, objective, to provide a kind of alternative financial structure for the global south. And then the third, cultural and people-to-people cooperation. So I'm really more interested in the third aspect, which is how people within the BRICS framework are cooperating. Now, of course, we know that you have your state level engagement, and then you have your non-state level engagement. And so within the BRICS framework, that is something that is slightly complicated. It's something that we're still beginning to figure out and to understand. Now, in terms of how BRICS works, and this is something that's useful to look at. BRICS is not supported by a permanent secretariat or office. What happens is that the chair of the BRICS rotates annually among the member states in the order of the acronym. So, it will sort of go from Brazil to Russia to India, China, South Africa, and so on. And the chair then sets up the priorities, the calendar of events for the year, as well as hosting the summit and all related meetings. Now, we are in South Africa. So last year, we know that South Africa was the chair and it hosted BRICS. And effectively, it was interesting to see how the South African government actually mobilized around this issue, making it sound as if, BRICS is this fabulous thing that, we all should get on board and we all should support and so on. But of course, there are many who are quite critical of that approach because they're finding that BRICS is not really all that, if I can put it like that. The chair, of course, whichever chair it is for the year, develops its annual priorities in consultation with other BRICS members. And whatever the agenda of the chair is or the member country is, it'll depend on that because each country then comes up with its own specific, agenda for the year. And just to kind of reflect on going back 15 years when, the BRICS was set up, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa represented over, I should say in 2011 rather, represented over 42% of the global population, 30% of the world's territory, 23% of GDP, and 18% of global trade. Just to give you some perspective of how sort of spread out the, BRICS membership is and who it actually represents in the world in terms of population, GDP, and trade. Okay. Now, an interesting aspect about BRICS, and this is something that I also want to speak to because we know that BRICS was set up initially as an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. And in the early phases of the BRICS conversation, the move was to set up an alternative bank, an alternative to the World Bank and IMF. And this alternative was called the New Development Bank. And it's considered the core institution of the BRICS framework. And the NDB aims to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects within the BRICS membership space, as well as other emerging markets and developing economies. And it is considered, as I said, an alternative to the very sort of what are considered hegemonic institutions of the Bretton Woods, such as the IMF and World Bank. And what does the NDB do? It offers loans, guarantees, other financial mechanisms to support the private projects that contribute to sustainable development and building out infrastructure. And it intends to offer more flexibility, greater equality among shareholders, and supposedly easier access to funds than the World Bank, which is supposed to service about 190 members. So when we start talking about how do the citizens actually benefit from this, the loans that are actually offered to member nations are actually looking at infrastructure that is going to assist the citizens that are basically going to be benefiting from the infrastructure that is developed. So moving on. So who does it lend to and on what grounds does it sort of lend money to? Basically, it focuses on clean energy, transportation issues, sanitation, social development, and it has, according to Ferragamo, sought to devote 40% of its projects to tackling climate change. So this is another interesting aspect of how the functioning of this New Development Bank and the kind of money that it lends out, what causes, what projects, what infrastructure is it actually benefiting. So to date, the bank has approved apparently more than $32 billion for around 96 projects since its operations began in 2016. And that's probably nowhere near what the IMF and the World Bank have done, but it's still quite significant and useful for us to reflect on. In addition to the New Development Bank, BRICS leaders also established the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, and this is a mechanism, if you're an economist, for providing financial support through additional liquidity and other means to BRICS countries during times of economic crisis. So let's try to understand also the architecture of BRICS, because this is where we start to begin to understand where do citizens fit in and how they actually fit in. So the BRICS framework claims that it has an architecture that goes across business, academia, media, the parliaments of the member nations, political parties, civil society, and sport. So, of course, some of these are, very much related to citizens and citizen involvement. And it is, the BRICS has formalized cooperation amongst each other with the establishment of these specific structures called the BRICS Business Council, the BRICS Think Tanks Council, and the BRICS Women's Business Alliance. In addition to this, it also has the sort of Business Forum and Business Council. These come together usually just before the main summit starts, and it, the business community talks to each other about expanding, diversifying trade, mutual investments, and so on. The BRICS Women's Business Alliance, of course, is trying to strengthen women's presence in the business sector, and looking at the need for greater economic inclusion of women in the economy. And then the BRICS Academic Forum, which is an interesting component, also takes place prior to the summits. It brings together academics from across BRICS. And this aspect of the academic forum is something I actually want to explore a bit more, because I want to see how it is that the academics are kind of brought together, which spaces they're coming from, and how they're kind of connecting. The BRICS Think Tanks Council. Now, this is another interesting component, and this, of course, works together with the BRICS Academic Council. It's responsible for sharing and disseminating information, research, policy analysis, prospective studies, capacity building, and so on. And in the 5 original member nations, the BRICS Think Tanks Council is made up of the following organizations, actually. These are institutes and organizations. So in Brazil, it's the Institute for Applied Economic Research. In Russia, it's the National Committee for BRICS Research. And in India, it's the Observer Research Foundation. And then the China Council for BRICS, as well as the Think Tank Corporation. And then in South Africa, it's the National Institute for Humanities and the South African BRICS Think Tank. So what you're seeing is that these sort of civil society structures are actually there to participate in these gatherings that happen just before the main summit, and these can be considered as part of that engagement with citizens and broader civil society. But of course, they're happening at a certain level. They're happening at business level, they're happening at academic level, and they're bringing in certain groups of people. It's not as if they're going into social movements and on the ground and speaking to the people who perhaps live in shack settlements or informal settlements. So this is something I also want to understand. Like, it's very much an elite engagement with citizens, and that's one of the things I wanted to reflect on. And the cooperation and coordination of BRICS in terms of its meetings and so on are managed by what are called BRICS Sherpas, because there's no central secretariat. And all of these decisions are taken in consultation with other BRICS members based upon consensus. Okay. Now, in terms of what are BRICS goals and aims, and because there's so many that have been identified, but I've just pulled these few together. According to Ferragamo, again, the first key role or aim is advocate for greater representation in global organizations. And we very often have heard leaders speak at many of these BRICS summits about the necessity to be represented in organizations like the United Nations and the other global structures. And of course, not only be represented in them, but to transform them and to change those spaces, because they're not necessarily working in favor of the global south or the oppressed or the masses or what have you. Secondly, the issue of coordinating economic policy. We know that in the Bretton Woods framework, there's a certain kind of policy that favors the industrialized nations and the Western nations, and they don't really work in favor of the global south. So this is another aspect of the goals and aims of this entity. Then thirdly, reduce reliance on the US dollar. Now, we know that the common currency within the Bretton Woods institutions is the dollar, and more frequently in the last few years, the BRICS countries have been trying to do trade in their local currencies. There's also been talk of creating a BRICS currency that would challenge the dollar and would oppose the sort of existence of the dollar. Well, we'll wait to see when that happens, if that happens. And then, of course, create an alternative finance system, which, we know that, for example, in terms of current trading systems, certain markets are favored, certain markets are given privileges, certain markets have to pay levies in order to trade in areas. So the system is set up to benefit a certain elite, and it really doesn't benefit the masses or the global south. And this is something that, is important for us to understand. So now moving into really what we want to get into and unpack. In 2012, Oxfam, which is a civil society organization in India, Oxfam India rather, it conducted a study titled Engaging BRICS, Challenges and Opportunities for Civil Society. And at that time, it was beginning to articulate aspirations of civil society. And one of the sort of findings, observations was that there is anticipation that the BRICS, building on their own lessons and initiatives, will play a progressive role on economic and social issues at regional and global levels. And the critical view, on the other hand, includes doubts about the nature and coherence of the group. So even then, civil society was wondering, how are these member states going to come together as a coherent group? There's also concern that the economic agenda of BRICS could pose new challenges to human rights and development, particularly given the absence of domestic frameworks for accountability on international engagements. The study went on further to argue that there's a growing awareness that civil society in BRICS countries must build a broader agenda of rights and accountability around the international roles of their government and private sector. So basically, what the study was reflecting was the views that civil society would like their governments, the members of BRICS, to effectively have all of these components built into the functioning of BRICS. Build a broader agenda of rights, focusing on human rights, accountability, and so on. And so this is a kind of a wish list that the study was reflecting. However, in a more recent article, Anthony van Niekerk, who analyzes the BRICS, the last BRICS Summit 2024, poses the question of how does one actually describe BRICS in a more contemporary context, and argues that BRICS Plus, which is combining the new members that have joined, is actually state-driven with civil society on the margins. And it reminds one of the African Union. And if you guys follow how the African Union works, you know that system. It reminds one of the African Union, which pays lip service to citizens' engagement in decision-making. So this is actually a criticism of how, Van Niekerk is actually looking at the functioning of BRICS. He also argues or raises the issue of policy coherence and asks whether economic and foreign policies are aligned within the BRICS bloc. For example, and this brings us to our case study of India and South Africa, both India and South Africa still trade with several Western countries who are outside of BRICS, yet also maintain close economic and diplomatic ties with countries like Russia and China, who are not regarded very favorably by those Western countries. So there's a kind of ideological almost antagonism that you can find there. Adebayo argues that the stance of non-alignment often taken by countries like India and South Africa allows them to maintain southern sovereignty, pursue socioeconomic development, and benefit from powerful external partners without having to choose sides. So this means that they're benefiting from both things, You're claiming that you're advancing interests of the global South, yet you're still, in bed with the Western G7 countries, and you're kind of not really on either side. And, this is another criticism. Ferragamo argues that BRICS was founded on the premise that international institutions were overly dominated by Western powers and had ceased to serve developing countries. The bloc has sought to coordinate its members' economic and diplomatic policies, found new financial institutions, and reduce dependence on the US dollar. Okay. So effectively, what we're saying is that there are multiple perspectives that are being raised by the within the scholarship around how BRICS is actually functioning, and especially some of the members of BRICS, right? There's no policy coherence, or that what is emerging is that these countries kind of align themselves with one position, but perhaps it's like the famous saying, talk left, walk right kind of scenario. So this brings me to the issue of many questions then arise around the utility and value of BRICS for the citizens of member nations, and whether the various structures of BRICS that have been mentioned earlier are actually providing anything substantive for ordinary people. And given that the main purpose of BRICS was to serve as an alternative form of financing for countries of the global south, the question arises, has there been any tangible benefits for citizens? And this is something that I think needs to be explored further with, substantive data being gathered. So given that BRICS, and I've made mention of this already, is an intergovernmental organization, it's clear that the voices of ordinary citizens are arguably only reflected through the structures that BRICS convene, such as the Business Forum, the Business Council, the Think Tanks Council, Women's Business Alliance, and there's even an employment working group that's been set up. So what this means is that there is no dedicated citizens forum that's been established, and this is an area that the BRICS heads of state need to focus on as they develop as BRICS, because this is clearly a gap that exists in terms of the functioning of BRICS. Now, coming to South Africa and India, which is what we really want to unpack. And I've made this point just now that both India and South Africa have a policy which relies on multilateralism, and nothing wrong with that, because it's something that is common within the international relations space. And then they also embrace the global south. But again, this raises questions of, whether there's a coherent policy position, or they're just sort of doing, it's sort of whatever works for both countries, and it isn't really taking a single strong position that will actually enhance the sort of fate, if we can call it that, of the global south. Both countries also have trade relations with G7 countries, as well as members of the developing world. And much of the engagement by the two nations within the BRICS space happens at government level, with the exception again of the various civil society structures that BRICS convenes. So it's clear that the policy positions of India and South Africa within the BRICS framework are clearly determined by their governments, and perhaps only influenced marginally to the extent that there is input by the members of, for example, the BRICS Think Tanks Council, which brings together academics and, thinkers and so on, which may or may not be considered. And this is, again, a gap in terms of the voice of citizens and the voice of civil society. There's also been some criticism of the fact that South Africa and India maintain strong diplomatic relations with both Russia and China, as well as with USA and other industrialized Western nations, which, as I've pointed out, can arguably lead to policy incoherence within the framework of BRICS. So let me start moving into conclusions. It's clear that BRICS has provided an alternative space for its members to challenge the status quo of how the international system functions. And that's a great start, and we have to commend BRICS for that. Over a 15-year period, it has attempted to find some kind of ideological and policy coherence that binds its members together. However, this is increasingly threatened by various global developments, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, political instability in the Middle East, and ongoing political ideological tensions at a global level. India and South Africa remain two members of BRICS who can ideally negotiate the terrain of political and economic engagement with both the global south as well as the Western nations. This presents both advantages and possible disadvantages in terms of trying to achieve the objectives that BRICS had originally set out to achieve. For example, how do you attempt to challenge the global financial status quo or reform international institutions if you are still complicit in and participating in those processes? So this raises the question, are these countries serious? Is South Africa serious about challenging the existing financial status quo? Is India serious about it as well? So effectively, what needs to happen is that citizens of both countries, India and South Africa, need to be more engaged around the utility of BRICS in terms of whatever role it plays, specifically in terms of advancing the welfare of ordinary people. So just in summary, it's clear that citizens don't really have as much of a voice, and they're not necessarily as active as they should be or could be within the BRICS framework, and they have a limited sort of representation and voice. And that is something that I believe needs to change in terms of how BRICS works. And so I will leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lubna, for giving us such an insightful seminar, and trying to, examine the infrastructure of BRICS and whether it is accommodative to, the third space, which is the civil society. And you raise very, very important questions. I mean, the dilemma that BRICS countries face, particularly those that are in the global south. They've got this vision of creating an alternative space, away from, the Western spheres of power, but at the same time, they are drawn, into those alliances with the Western powers such as the US, UK, and Germany. So we really appreciate your inputs. I will go to the audience. If there are any questions, then the floor is open. You can just show me by raising your hand, and then you can just go for your question.
So there's 2 hands in the room here. Stanford.
Okay. You can navigate on your side. Sorry to give you that responsibility, Lubna.
That's fine. Do you want to
Yes.
come and speak into the mic here? So yes, Shona has a question.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lubna. That was really, really interesting. I'm hoping to talk to you more about this. The thing that I wanted to ask is I don't claim to be very conversant with the BRICS spaces and opportunities, but the thing that strikes me is I don't understand how it's an opportunity for global South civil society to form a pole of power, if you like. We had a discussion at CCS a couple of years ago, which said that civil society could form an alternate pole of power if it was strong enough and if civil society came together rather than working in silence, right? I don't understand how it could form this pole of power if, we have new civil society colleagues that come from contexts where there's gross human rights violations, where there's sort of authoritarian tendencies. I just don't really see the potential for that space, other than if that space were to be built, it could be a way for the BRICS civil society coalition to make their own governments accountable to them. That might be a starting point. But I feel like this is going to be a long time in the making, and I'm not sure if it's going to be of any real value. That's my question. Thank you. I guess it's also an observation.
Thank you very much for that, Shona. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, maybe you can take on your side. You said there are 2 on your side,
Yes,
and
yes.
then we'll have 2 questions, and then we'll.
So
you can attend to those questions, Lubna. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a comment and followed by a question. When there was at the height of the so-called South American pink tide, there was contrived this Union of South American Nations at the time, which has its design has some similarities with the BRICS in the sense of the decisions are taken by consensus, and there was also this discussion about alternative financial mechanisms. But what I want to comment on is that at that point at some point they did open a space for civil society organizations participate. So there would be this forum, and I've participated in one of them, and my feeling was that we were just helping to legitimize that stance without any meaningful voice on what was being decided. And then my question is, how do you read these the amplification of BRICS, like the invite for these new countries? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And specifically, you mentioned like Ethiopia, like of all African countries. Well, there's Egypt, but among the sub-Saharan countries. So why do you think Ethiopia specifically was invited?
thank you very much. Should I answer those questions, or should I take more? Danford, up to you.
No, you can answer the two questions, Lubna, and then we'll take more questions after you've attended to the two questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Shana. It's a very important question regarding how is it that these members of this BRICS formation could actually form an alternative sort of, powers entity, or given some of the human rights records. And this is the key question. China, we know, has really come under criticism for its human rights abuses. Russia is another one. India has its own issues, with what is happening in Kashmir and our occupation there. South Africa obviously has issues. Brazil has gone through its own. So it's something that's quite, I think, interesting, because this is why civil society actually needs to be more involved, because the governments of the member states are not, their hands are not clean. They're not, sort of these very innocent, angelic, what you would call entities that can claim, oh, well, we, like, for example, America goes around bombing other countries and, dropping bombs and still sending bombs to other countries to bomb innocent people. But the countries of the BRICS formation have their own human rights challenges and their own violations of human rights. So I think initially when they began thinking about coming together, they were looking at a structure that would benefit them as government, which is an alternative space to play in with regards to, the sort of, because obviously they realize that they don't really have that much power as, for example, the G7 does. So it was really about creating an alternative space of power for themselves. But they clearly are also complicit in a lot of, So I think that this is where you really do need citizens, not just of the member nations of BRICS, but citizens from across the world to actually hold these countries accountable for what they're doing. I mean, we know that states generally, tend to take positions that service their own interests, and they don't necessarily always consider that of, the people. So how it's going to be an alternative, it's attempting to do that, but it needs to be held accountable. And, that's why I said there's a lot of criticism of the BRICS space. And that's why we need a bigger kind of component, or a kind of a much more expanded involvement by citizens globally to make BRICS more legitimate, more accountable, if I can put it like that. Thank you, Fabio, for your question. Yes, you're right about the fact that some of these spaces that were made available for civil society to participate were actually just basically trying to amplify, or sorry, we're trying to actually legitimize the voice of or the position that was being taken without necessarily hearing what the people were saying on the ground. And this is very often what tends to happen, that governments will go out and do some kind of consultation, or they'll engage in some type of public participation and say, oh, well, we spoke to the people, we heard what they had to say, and now we can go ahead and do what we want. And this is, again, another challenge where civil society does not always agree with the positions taken by the government. And that's why when this kind of thing happens, you actually have to have a strong civil society voice to object, to rise up and say, we don't agree with what you're doing. And that's very important. Amplification of the sort of new membership of BRICS and why the new countries that have joined BRICS. Well, I think that with the African members that have been invited to come on board, like Egypt and Ethiopia, I think it's really to expand into a regional kind of, a new regional space, so to speak. I think that, Ethiopia's GDP compared to Egypt's is, definitely not on the same level, but both come with perhaps their own regional strengths, which is what the BRICS formation is wanting to tap into. And of course, their growing markets, for example, expanding markets that they have, as well as other localized, I'll have to go and do more research on this. I don't want to just say, but I think from the way in which I've been picking up, both these countries have a lot to offer for what the BRICS formation really wants. And also inviting the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to have greater footprint in the Middle East. That's very clear, obviously. Why, Argentina was invited? Well, obviously to have another South American person on board, and they decided to not accept the invite. So that's pretty much, I think, how to answer the question. But I just want to go back to the Zoom to take more questions. Thank you so much for both of your questions. Back to you, Danford.
Okay, thanks, Lubna. We've got some, I think, 6 more minutes. We can take questions from those in the virtual space. Please show me your hand, and then if there are any questions. Maybe, Lubna, if I can ask you, how does, active citizenship, how do you want it to look like within the BRICS structures? I know you talked of the think tanks that that consist of academics and so forth. Do you want it to go beyond that, as in terms of the understanding of active citizenship?
Well, I think that participation by citizens must include all voices, and it should not be simply an elite voice or a privileged voice. It has to include the voices of those who are, economically marginalized or underprivileged, the voice of those who, might be perhaps from a minority community in that society. It has to be representative, because if you're talking about citizenship, you really, and again, citizenship is a complicated term, because for example, in South Africa, we have people living in South Africa who are not citizens of South Africa, but they do have a voice, and they should have a voice, and they should be able to participate in various, so I think that when I talk about citizenship, I'm sort of speaking about it in a broader context of civil society more broadly. And you don't necessarily have to have the passport of the country that you live in, but you should be able to have a voice, and that you should be able to be involved. And how I envision active citizenship is that every person who has a stake in that society, in that community, should be able to participate, express themselves, and have the opportunity to be able to do so. And the BRICS frameworks must make those things possible. They must make it happen. And I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think, it's about inclusion for me, inclusivity of all voices.
Okay, thank you so much. Any question from the virtual audience, or I can also take on your side, Lubna, in the seminar room, if there is any student who want to ask, or any among the audience?
Any takers? No, I think the questions have been already asked. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Lubna. I think I will wrap it up now. Thank you for joining us. It was a very interesting and insightful presentation. So we are going to upload this seminar and share with fellow scholars and fellow comrades who are interested in this international relations or international politics that has to do with BRICS. Thank you so much for your time. I don't know if maybe Shona, you've got anything to say. May I also take this opportunity to greet Fabio. Sorry, I couldn't make it for the tea party, so I can meet you in person. But I heard your voice. Greetings from my side. Is there anything that Shona wants to say, or any closing remarks from you, Lubna, and then we'll call it a day?
No, Dan, just to say thanks to Lubna. Fabio, did you want to say something? Oh, no. Just to say thanks so much to Lubna, and thanks, Dan, for facilitating. We missed you at the tea party. We had the good chocolate cake.
Yes, I know your chocolate cakes are fire, Shona. I know.
Thank you very much to you, Dan, for facilitating today's session, and to Shona and the CCS for inviting me to be a part of this, or to share my thoughts on this topic. And thank you to the online audience for your attention. And I'm happy to continue this conversation, both over chocolate cake or online. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you so much. Let's meet next time. Be on the lookout for our adverts, and then we'll meet next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.